Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for EMBCA's 4th annual commemoration of the burning of Smyrna on its 100th anniversary. My name is Lou Katsos, EMBCA's president, and I will introduce and moderate today's panel. Our distinguished panel will include writer-artist THEA HALO, and author of the book, Not in My Name, Even in My Name. ISMINI, the director of the Modern Greek program in the Department of Classics at Georgetown University and author of the new book, The Gentle American, George Horton's Odyssey and His True Account of the Smyrna Catastrophe. Author-writer Lou URENECK, professor of journalism, retired at Boston University and author of the book, Smyrna, September 1922, The American Mission to Rescue Victims of the 20th Century's First Genocide. Author-engineer SAVVAS Sam KOKTZOGLOU, and co-author of the book, The Greek Genocide in American Naval War Diaries, Naval Commander's Report, and the Protest, Death Marches, and Massacres in Turkey's Pontus region, 1921 to 1922. Sculptor artist George Petrides, whose bronze Hellenic head entitled The Refugee relating to the Smyrna burning will be erected in a 100th anniversary ceremony in Athens this week on September 14th. And PETER STAVRIANIDIS, PhD educator, community leader in Hellenic Genocide Issues. We hope this panel discussion and conversation contributes to a continuing wave of research, discussions, activism, justice, and results in terms of recognition of this very important event, as well as the historic systemic genocide committed relating to it. May the memories of those that perished and those subjected to inhuman cruelties be eternal and never forgotten. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the burning of Smyrna and part of the final chapter of what has been described by authors Benny Morris and Dor Zev book, The 30-Year Genocide, Turkey's Destruction of Its Christian Communities and Minorities, 1894 to 1924. The burning of Smyrna, the Smyrna Catastrophe in the Hellenic Catastrophe refers to the deliberately set fire 4 days after the Turkish forces entered and captured the port city of cosmopolitan Smyrna towards the end of the Turkish Hellenic War of 1919-1922 in Asia Minor, and which completely destroyed its Hellenic and Armenian quarters. The fire was started on September 13th and extinguished September 22nd in 1922. Turkish troops, per eyewitnesses, systematically cordoned off the quay to contain the Hellenes and Armenians within their fire zone quarters and prevented them from fleeing. The estimated Hellenic and Armenian deaths resulting in the fire range up to 100,000 people. Approximately up to 400,000 Hellenic and Armenian refugees were in the city from other parts of Asia Minor to escape the troops and irregulars, cramming its waterfront and quays to escape from the horrific flames. Eyewitnesses report describing panic-stricken civilian refugees diving into the water to escape the flames, and that their terrified screaming could be heard miles away. They were forced to remain there under harsh conditions and were periodically robbed for 2 weeks, and after having had massacres and atrocities committed to them before the outbreak of the fire. Women were raped, and tens of thousands of Hellenic and Armenian men were subsequently deported into the interior of Anatolia, where many died in harsh and brutal conditions. After the burning of Smyrna, the Hellenic city, founded over 3,000 years before, a jewel and major city of the Eastern Mediterranean, ceased in any meaningful way to have Hellenic residents. Also, we commemorate today the 100th anniversary of the lynching in Smyrna of Metropolitan Chrysostomos Kallifatis, known as Saint Chrysostomos of Smyrna. He was killed by a lynch mob incited by Nureddin Pasha, the then military governor of Smyrna, on September 9th, 1922, after Turkish troops took back the city. According to eyewitness accounts, he was tied to a barber chair, cruelly tortured, and put to death. They riddled him with stabs. They tore his beard off. They gouged his eyes out, cut his nose and ears, and then dragged him through the city of Smyrna by car or truck into the back streets of Iki Chesmeli district, where he died soon afterwards on September 10th. He was unanimously declared an ethno-martyr and saint of the Orthodox Church by the Holy Synod of the Church of Greece in 1992. And today, September 11th, is his commemoration day in the Orthodox Church. May his memory be eternal. Before we start our panelist presentations and discussions, we would be remiss in not remembering also and taking a moment of silence for the almost 3,000 innocents who were brutally murdered on September 11th, 2001 in the World Trade Center in New York City, the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, and the fields of Sharksville, Pennsylvania. May their memories also be eternal. A moment of silence, please. I have the pleasure now of introducing our panelists and starting with THEA HALO. She's a writer and artist. Although THEA HALO's first career was as a painter, in 1997, Ms. HALO worked as a news correspondent for the public radio station WBAI in New York City and produced and moderated a number of shows for a public radio station in upstate New York. In 1989, she brought her mother, Sano Themia, back to Turkey to find her lost home. In 1992, she commenced the writing of her mother's memoir, Not Even My Name, which garnered the first US resolution recognizing the genocide of the Pontic Greeks. Many other state resolutions followed after Ms. HALO gave book readings and lectures to Greek American communities and state officials. She has won numerous awards for her poetry and her literary and political essays, including the 2002 AHEPA Homer Award and the Greek American Professional Women's Award for her profound contribution to literature and to Hellenic culture, heritage, and history. In 2007, she, along with Professor Adam Jones, introduced a resolution to the International Association of Genocide Scholars to recognize the genocide of the Pontian and other Asia Minor Greeks and Assyrians as comparable to the genocide of the Armenians. After a struggle to allow the vote, the resolutions were overwhelmingly approved by the hundreds of IAGS scholars. Based on the resolution, Sweden in 2010, the Netherlands 2015, Austria 2015, Armenia 2015, South Wales 2015, and the US 2019, and finally Australia 2021 have all issued historic resolutions acknowledging the destruction of the three indigenous Christian peoples of the Ottoman Empire, Greeks, Assyrians, and Armenians, as genocide. Ms. HALO's papers on the genocide have been included in a number of books, and her manuscript, tentatively entitled From Blood and Ashes, will be translated into Greek and published in Greece. It is also being considered by another publisher for an English edition. THEA's brief presentation is entitled Background to the Catastrophe in Smyrna. Welcome, THEA, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I thought in order to understand what took place in Smyrna, I thought some historical background would help set the stage for the Smyrna catastrophe. First, we must look at the key players in the drama. On the one side, there was King Constantine I of Greece, whose wife Sophia was the sister of the German Kaiser. Then there is Eleftherios Venizelos, Greece's prime minister, Lloyd George, who was the prime minister of the United Kingdom at the time, and Greece's other World War I allies, Italy, France, and Russia. On the other side, we have Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, the Young Turks, and later Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Greece's Megali idea which envisioned a greater Greece by retaking ancient lands in Anatolia, went back to the 1800s. However, it seems clear that after the Balkan Wars, which were instigated by the treatment of the Christian populations by the Ottomans, Greece's Megali idea was not in play. Venizelos had made sure there were no land bridges between Greece and Turkey in order to assure the Turks that Greece had no intention of taking the wars further. At the time, the young Turks seemed satisfied by these assurances. The Greeks of Anatolia were relatively unmolested before March 1913, when King George of Greece was still alive. However, after King George's death, and almost immediately after Prince Constantine I became king of Greece, the young Turks instigated attacks on the Greeks in Thrace to force them to leave the country. Greece immediately agreed to an exchange of populations, allegedly to allow the Muslim refugees from the Balkan Wars to emigrate to Ottoman territory. Even though most of the Balkan refugees were not from Greece, the Thracian Greeks were not compensated for lost lives, businesses, or personal chattel. In 1914, before the outbreak of World War I, the young Turks ordered boycotts of Anatolian Greek businesses along the Aegean coast of Anatolia. Soon after, tens of thousands of Anatolian Greeks were attacked and displaced, leading to thousands of deaths. Morgenthau confirmed that when the young Turks began their nationalizing plan for Eastern Thrace and Anatolia, the Greeks were the first victims. It's difficult, or perhaps impossible, to find pleas from Constantine to his brother-in-law, the Kaiser, or from Queen Sophia to her brother, asking him to cease both Germany's propaganda campaign against the Anatolian Greeks and Germany's policy of displacement of the Greeks in Anatolia. During their reign of terror against the Anatolian Greeks, Greek nationals living in Anatolia were unharmed because, according to the Turkish Governor General in Smyrna, Rami Bey, and I quote, King Constantine was in reality an ally of Turkey, and that he was preventing Greece from going into the war, end quote. This was undoubtedly true. When Venizelos briefly resumed the post of Prime Minister of Greece in 1915 and again in 1917, when King Constantine abdicated, the Young Turks and Lehman von Sanders briefly stopped Greek deportations. A description in a special correspondence of the London Morning Post leaves no room for speculation as to whom the King and Queen of Greece were loyal. I quote, "The Greek massacres organized by the Turks and Germans, like the Armenian ones, had for their object the extermination of a race. During the first persecution, the Greek government did everything possible to protect their co-nationals. But during the second outbreak, King Constantine impeded every possible movement for the amelioration of the lot of that unfortunate race. Reports sent to the government by dignitaries of the Orthodox Church in Asia Minor were suppressed. Numerous documents dealing with these massacres were stolen from the government archives and destroyed. On one occasion, the Bishop of Pera traveled from Constantinople to Athens to implore the king to protest more energetically. He was not received by the king, but by Queen Sophia, who cut the conversation short with the words, "Return immediately to Constantinople. The will of the king is that you live on good terms with the Turks." During this reign of terror against Anatolian Greeks, the Greek nationals living in Anatolia were unharmed because, according to Turkish Governor General of Smyrna, Rami Bey, I quote, "King Constantine was in reality an ally of Turkey, and that he was preventing Greece from going into the war," end quote. When Venizelos briefly resumed the post as prime minister in Greece in 1915 and again in 1917, after King Constantine's abdication, the Young Turks and Lehman von Sanders briefly stopped Greek deportations. Some believe that Constantine's loyalties to Germany were greater than his loyalties to the Allied powers. Some even believed his loyalties to Germany exceeded his loyalties to Greece, the nation he ruled. It was only in June of 1917, due to pressure from Allied backing of Venizelos' government in exile, that King Constantine I finally abdicated. By 1917, when Greece finally joined the war on the side of the Allies, hundreds of thousands of Greeks under Ottoman rule had already lost their lives, their possessions, and/or had been hopelessly displaced. We jump ahead to the post-World War I Treaty of Sevres, signed on August 10, 1920, but never ratified. Greece was awarded Smyrna and environs. There is no way of knowing whether Venizelos would have considered occupying more areas of Anatolia once Greece occupied Smyrna. We do know, however, that Britain's request that Venizelos send troops to defend Britain in Constantinople against Mustafa Kemal's forces, and Greece's successful three-pronged attack against Kemal's forces opened the door of possibilities for Venizelos to transform the Megali idea into an agenda. Greece's decision to expand her territorial holdings was both due to the continuing attacks on Pontic Greeks and the activities of the Allies in other parts of Turkey. In fact, Greece was not the only ally attempted to grab land from the former Ottoman Empire after World War I. Britain, France, and Italy were in Constantinople after the war, and Britain was making moves to form a permanent presence. Italy, expecting the terms of a secret agreement that brought her into the war be fulfilled. Therefore, Italy occupied parts of southern Turkey without invitation. This had prompted the Greek landing at Smyrna in May of 1919. In 1920, France laid claims to Syria and southern Anatolia and promised the Armenians portions of the spoils in Cilicia for their help. Backed by Russia, on the Eastern Front, the newly formed Republic of Armenia also attacked to secure the provisions of the Treaty of Sevres. It wasn't until October 1920, after the successful rescue of the British at Constantinople, that Greece began her own campaign to finally fulfill the Megali idea. Greece's troops successfully moved towards Ankara. The concerted Allied attack on all fronts became known as Turkey's War of Independence. Under Venizelos' government, with King Alexander on the throne, Greece had the full support of Britain's Lloyd George. It was support that failed to include financial aid or the approval of the British public, however. Almost before the offensive began, King Alexander suddenly died at the age of 27 of a bite from his favorite monkey. It was a bite that changed the course of history for Greece, her former allies, and for Turkey. Greece, weary from years of war, voted Venizelos out of office once again. After a plebiscite under the new government of Demetrius Rallis, King Constantine I returned to the Greek throne. Although the Allies trusted Venizelos, King Constantine's past performance during the Great War placed Greece in a precarious position with the Allies. As if his return was not enough to cause tensions, Constantine ordered the experienced military commanders who had served under Venizelos' government in Asia Minor replaced with his own inexperienced commanders. Others resigned in protest. Greece's advance to central Turkey under Constantine gave rise to fears among the Allies that Greece would expect to take everything for itself. Greece was dependent on the good graces of the Allies to conduct a sustained, successful military campaign in Turkey. What appears to be beyond doubt is the guaranteed failure of Greece's advance under King Constantine's command, not only due to his inexperienced commanders, but because the king was roundly mistrusted and even hated by the Allies. At the very least, Greece could not afford the betrayal of her allies, France, Italy, and Russia, all of whom chose to support Kemal's forces against Greece by supplying arms and other support to Kemal's nationalists, while Greece's supplies were cut, ensuring her defeat. This colossal betrayal of Greece by her former allies would also have enormous consequences for the Allies themselves. Allied support for Kemal's nationalists against Greece also put an end to the Allied designs on Constantinople and Anatolia. It was a case of cutting off one's nose to spite one's face. This was the prelude to the catastrophe at Smyrna. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Thea. There's obviously everything you discussed. We can have many panel discussions on just that topic because there's a lot of different angles to this. Thank you again. Our next presenter will be ISMINI Lamb, Professor Lamb. ISMINI Lamb is the director of the Modern Greek Studies program at Georgetown University, where she teaches all levels of the modern Hellenic language, history, and a wide range of interdisciplinary courses on Hellenic culture, including courses on media, film, Byzantine history, civilization, the Orthodox faith, and Hellenic business culture. And she's done this for more than 30 years. Her research interests include the influence of political ethos and media on Hellenic national identity and expression, modern Hellenic reception studies, national and ecumenical Hellenism. Her research and courses also address social and humanitarian issues, including the recent refugee crises. In the past 9 years, she has labeled as the authorized biographer George Horton. She speaks frequently on diverse issues, including Horton's historic legacy. Her co-authored biography of George Horton, entitled The Gentle American, George Horton's Odyssey, and his true account of the Smyrna Catastrophe, was published this past month by George's Press. She is a former C.S. Lewis Fellow, a Doyle Fellow, and has held numerous and multiple leadership positions in civic organizations. Her Professor Lamb's presentation, in that presentation, she will share some insights from the Horton biography, The Gentle American. Thank you for being with us, ISMINI, and a pleasure always for you to be on the panels. This is our fourth, for the audience, this is our fourth annual panel relating to the Smyrna catastrophe. ISMINI.
Well, thank you, Lou, to you and to EMBCA for having me. It is indeed a great honor to participate on such a distinguished panel. And as you said, my topic today concerns George Horton, the American Consul General in Smyrna when it was destroyed by the Turkish Nationalist Army in 1922. Well, after 9 years of research, my co-author and I, Chris Lamb and I, have just published this biography, as you said. And given our limited time today, I want to make just 3 quick points about Horton by answering the following questions. First, who was Horton and why should we trust his testimony? Second, what did he do that made a difference? And third, why does his life matter? So, who was George Horton, and is he indeed a reliable witness to history? The question is very important because authors who deny genocides in Asia Minor have blackguarded Horton as an anti-Turkish bigot. Ad hominem attacks are illogical, but even some scholars have attacked George Horton's character to argue that Horton cannot be trusted as a witness to history. In reality, as our biography demonstrates, Horton was an erudite, learned man who venerated the truth and reported it to the Department of State faithfully. At age 19, in his college graduation poem, he celebrated the value of deathless truth as his life ambition, and he never abandoned that conviction. 40 years later, he told the 1921 graduating class of the International College in Smyrna that their goals should be, and I'll quote him, building up a reputation for truthfulness and honesty. Every time one speaks, he should think, is that the truth or not? He assured the graduates that a lie will be found out sooner or later, and he admonished them to, and I quote again, remember that the least prevarication is dangerous and apt to soil your precious good name. Whenever I even suspect a young man or woman in my employ of fibbing to me, I lose confidence in that person, and his or her career is practically finished, so far as I'm concerned. One of Horton's favorite sayings was, "The truth will out," and his reports do reflect that. He was very careful to distinguish between what he knew was true and what he thought was likely true from evidence gathered by diverse sources, and he had many. Horton was a Christian and a humanitarian who willingly helped people of all faiths, the exact opposite, in other words, of a bigot. Motivated by his Christian faith, Horton intervened to save people throughout his career, regardless of race, creed, or color. To cite just a few examples, his first major effort at organizing relief came in 1912 when he mounted a relief effort for Muslim refugees from the Balkan Wars. During World War I, he brought the Red Cross and the YMCA to Greece and facilitated their good works, which ultimately saved hundreds of thousands of lives. He also aided Jews persecuted in Smyrna during the war, and those left homeless after the great 1917 fire in Salonika. Toward the end of his career in Smyrna, he aided so many Muslims that in some quarters he was considered pro-Turk, like in Athens, for example. And of course, he aided countless Greeks and other Christians fleeing Turkish wrath. With that, allow me to quickly survey what Horton did that was important. Horton is not well known, and those who have written about him never understood exactly what he did in Smyrna. They also have wildly misconstrued the purpose of his book, The Blight of Asia. Moreover, virtually no one knows the role he played in defeating the Lausanne Treaties in the US Senate. We do not have time to discuss the real message in his book, The Blight of Asia, or detail how he helped defeat the Lausanne Treaty in the US Senate, but let me briefly illuminate what he did in Smyrna. As World War I ended, he exhorted Americans to secure the peace and reject isolationism. Even before the armistice was signed, he warned of ongoing Turkish persecution of Christians and Armenians in particular. He also explained to the Department of State what really happened when the Greeks landed in Smyrna. Horton highlighted both the premeditated Turkish ambush of Greek troops, as well as the Allied leaders' indifference and refusal to support the occupation that they themselves had directed. Without staunch Allied support, he predicted the use of Greek troops would be a catastrophe and that would also inflame Turkish resistance and bankrupt Greece, which of course happened. Most importantly, he exposed Admiral Bristol's false reporting that was helping isolate Greece. As an aside, I have to say that Bristol's reporting and actions were duplicitous and jaw-droppingly immoral, and sometimes manifestingly, stupid in ways that defy belief. He repeatedly turned history on its head, blithely reporting the exact opposite of the facts. He made inane arguments that can scarcely be comprehended. For example, he argued for sacrificing 60,000 Armenian orphans, and for what purpose, but he didn't want to evacuate them, hoping to substantiate Kemal's promises of benign treatment of the Christians. He also repeatedly argued Christian victims should not resist massacre, and that doing so just irritated the Turks, causing them more violence. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, you heard right. But getting back to Horton, he helped Christian refugees to evacuate and asked for American warships, humanitarian aid, and permission to negotiate a ceasefire to prevent violence. Sadly, President Harding and his Secretary of State Hughes denied his request to mediate. During 11 days of hell in Smyrna, Horton fought Bristol and his Chief of Staff, Captain Hepburn. They resolutely refused to evacuate Greek Americans, wanted to prove Turkish rule over Christians would be benign. People died as a result. However, Horton eventually prevailed, forcing Bristol and Hepburn to authorize evacuation, which saved many lives. Now, if time permitted, we could also recount how Horton helped secure more assistance for the refugees once he was in Athens, and then how he fought a 5-year battle for the truth about what happened in Asia Minor, ending with the Senate's voting down a treaty of friendship with Turkey. He did that while Bristol and his friend Alan Dulles, who had become the chief of the Near East Division in 1922, covered up Turkish atrocities, promoted fake news, lied to Congress, and blackguarded Horton with false reports. Rather than go into those details, I will just note that because of Horton and other like-minded Americans, the United States did not go down in history as our European allies did, for absolving the Turks of genocide and, in fact, rewarding them for it. Finally, does any of this matter? Some will say it happened 100 years ago. Let bygones be bygones and forget about it. That would be a very big mistake. It mattered then, and it still matters today. It matters because if the truth had been reported and disseminated by American officials, many more lives could have been saved. It is important to understand what a close-run thing the fighting was. Despite no aid from Britain or the US to Greece, and French, Italian, and Soviet support for Kemal, as THEA just told us, the Greeks alone almost defeated Kemal's forces at the 1921 Battle of Sakarya. With either US or British aid, it could have gone the other way. The climactic moment came just after Smyrna, when, flushed with victory, Kemal decided to eliminate the remaining 1.5 million Christians in Anatolia. Outraged, the British asked the United States to join them in an ultimatum to the Turks. At that very moment, with much hanging in the balance, Dulles suppressed Horton's reporting. And I must say, accurate reporting. Secretary Hughes went to President Harding to discuss intervention with the British without seeing Horton's report. Excuse me. If Horton's views had been presented, the Secretary and President might have made a different decision on intervention, changing history and the diversity of the Middle East as well, and thus its liberality. Also, as I mentioned to another EMBCA audience last year, rewarding Turkey for genocide has had quite profound historical effects, and not good ones. German leaders admired the Turks for fighting back against the harsh post-war treaties, defeating the Allied powers, and wiping out their internal enemies. The Germans rationalized Turkish genocide and then emulated it when the Nazis came to power. These issues still matter today, and for many reasons. All you have to do is look at the genocide in China, the Uyghur genocide, the rise of neo-Ottomanism, and Erdogan's saber rattling, and even the horrible events that took place on 9/11 in this country. But having exhausted my allotted time, I will stop here, confident that our other distinguished panelists will have a lot to say on these topics. Thank you so much for your time, your attention, as well as the opportunity to share a few facts about Horton, his life, and why it mattered. Thank you.
Thank you, ISMINI. And for the audience who may not know, 4 years ago when we did our first panel discussion, relating to the burning of Smyrna, We were actually attacked, and as a matter of fact, ISMINI was attacked directly. And we had a lot of Turkish American organizations who were trying to create a dangerous situation if we, in fact, had our panel discussion. Fortunately, we had Congresswoman Maloney, who helped us with security. And there was some very nasty correspondence that took place with Georgetown, with the university, asking for ISMINI to be basically fired because of her stand. And we are fortunate she's with us, and we're fortunate that we have Georgetown University, which supports free thought and actually the truth. Thank you again, ISMINI, for being here today. And I should mention also that ISMINI will have a panel discussion on Saturday, this coming Saturday at Georgetown, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. And that will also be an interesting event. Our next presenter is author-writer Lou URENECK, professor of journalism, retired at Boston University, and author of the book Smyrna, September 1922, the American Mission to Rescue Victims of the 20th Century's First Genocide. He has written 3 books and now working on a 4th. He has taught in professional settings as a writing coach for media and research organizations. And his work has appeared in the New York Times, Philadelphia Inquirer, the International Herald Tribune, Boston Globe, Neiman Reports, and Field and Stream. Lou is the editor of the was the editor of the Horton Press Herald, and a senior editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Professor URENECK was a Neiman Fellow and an editor in residence at Harvard University. As a Fulbright senior specialist, he taught at the National University in Kiev. He was the Eleftherios Venizelos Chair in Modern Greek Studies at the American College of Greece in Athens, and has been inducted into the Maine Journalism Hall of Fame. His book, Backcast, won the National Outdoor Book Award for Literary Merit in 2007. He has received the Hellenic Heritage Award, and the New England Academy of Journalists named him a recipient of the Yankee Quill Award, New England's highest individual award for journalism. He has been a professor of journalism at Boston University from 2004 until recently when he retired, and was the chairman of the Department of Journalism at Boston University from 2006 to 2010. In this presentation, he will address the question that is in the background of some of the discussion we've been having over the burning of the city. Was it reasonable for a nation of Greece to be engaged in the annexation of Smyrna? Welcome, Professor Lou URENECK, and thank you for being with us today.
Lou, thank you for having me, and it's an honor to be a part of this panel with so many distinguished scholars, writers, and speakers. So I really appreciate the invitation. Fortunately, the nightmare of the burning of Smyrna is becoming more and more known after decades, a century really, of mostly silence. So that's a good thing. I thought what I would try to do very briefly this afternoon is summarize the arguments for and against Greece's occupation of Smyrna and its attempt really to annex that part of Asia Minor into the Greek state. And I've thought a lot about this question, both from an ethical perspective and also from a geopolitical perspective. You know, so what are the arguments for and against what happened that ultimately culminated in this calamity and this catastrophe? Well, as I understand them, the arguments for Greece's occupation and attempt to annex that part of the Ionian coast of Asia Minor are as follows. There's the irredentist argument, and that is that Greeks, or people that we call Greeks, people who spoke Greek, have lived there since time immemorial, at least several centuries before the birth of Christ. Names such as Herodotus and Homer and others are associated with that part of Asia Minor. We think of the Ionian League and so forth. So there is this ancient claim, as is often made along the Pontic coast as well, but I'm speaking now of the Ionian coast, that Greece has a historical claim, in a sense, to that land. It's an analogous in some ways to the Jewish claim of the Holy Land. It's our land from time immemorial, and we want it back. So that's one argument. A second argument is this notion that the formation of the Greek state out of the Ottoman Empire was a continuing project that began in the 1820s and really lasted a century. And that the attempt to bring the Ionian region into the nation of Greece, the small nation of Greece, was not dissimilar from the inclusion, the annexation of Epirus and Thrace, okay? A growing nation that had a vision for a larger Greece. Interestingly, this is an idea that I think gets more developed in the new book that'll be out by Mark Mazauer. I haven't read the book yet. I don't think it's been released, but in the reviews, there's been a discussion of this idea of Greece as a continuing project in terms of its landmass. The third argument that's often brought forward to justify the Greek position is the British promises made to Greece during World War I. The Brits, obviously, the Allies wanted to bring Greece into the war on their side, and they promised Greece Smyrna, essentially. They had made the same promise to Italy, but nonetheless, a promise was made to Greece that if it entered the war, it would be rewarded with territory. The fourth argument, and closer to the event itself, that is frequently made, is that really what happened, the reason the Greeks arrived at Smyrna in May of 1919 was an attempt by the Americans and the British to forestall a landing south of Smyrna by the Italians. The Italians were not happy with the way the negotiations were going. They thought they were going to be cut out of their piece of Asia Minor. And so they acted unilaterally, or they attempted to act unilaterally. Wilson was angry, Lloyd George was angry, and so the Greeks were sent in to try to forestall, and they did forestall, that Italian invasion, or at least Italian occupation. And then the fifth argument that is made is that, and this is the part of the Venizelos argument, and that is that the Greeks, the ethnic Greeks, they were Ottoman subjects, but the ethnic Greeks in Asia Minor needed protection, that they were harassed and killed by their neighbors and by the Turkish government and so forth. And without the Greek army present, that harassment and killing would continue. So as I understand it, those are the arguments in favor of Greece arriving at Smyrna and occupying it. Now, there are several arguments against it as well. And if I were to summarize them, I would say this: from a military perspective, and perhaps from a governance perspective as well, when we talk about the Ionian coast, and if we talk about bringing that into the Greek nation, this is a place that is not continuous with the landmass of Greece. So it would be a rather odd situation to have a piece of Greece separated from the nation itself. The second argument against a Greek possession of Smyrna in that region is the power and scope of Turkish nationalism. This is obviously a force that was underestimated by the Greeks and by the Allies as well. But it's one that needs to be acknowledged. If we were to put ourselves back in Athens in that period of time, there seems to have been a tremendous undervaluing of the force and power of Turkish nationalism that was not going to go away. The third argument against the Greek position is the ambivalence of President Wilson. And Wilson was a great leader and he had great ideas and so forth, but his ideas on what should happen in Turkey were never really clear, and they were frequently ambiguous. But it has become clear, if you read the record, that he was not ultimately in favor of dividing up what we now think of as the Turkish nation into smaller pieces, with a piece going to Greece and a piece going to France and England and so forth. He was really in favor of maintaining the coherence of Asia Minor as a Turkish state. The fourth point I'd like to make is the unreliability, really, of Britain after the war. Britain's policing of Asia Minor and of the Turkish situation was essential, but after the war, Britain was broke, and not unlike the United States, sort of entering a period of isolationism, and it was not a country to be relied upon. Certainly after the treaty at SAVVAS. Then the fifth one I would make is the rejection of Venizelos by the Greek nation, and then the return of King Constantine, and then ultimately Constantine's overreach in Asia Minor, including even the talk of annexing Constantinople. This all worked against the Greeks. It was too much, too soon for a small nation. The Allies were not going to stand for it. And Greece really did not have the power to make any of this happen. So, as we weigh the pros and cons of this 100 years later, history has come down on the side of what happened, and we know what happened. So, what lessons were learned? I think one lesson is that small nations, such as Greece, undertake big projects such as this at great risk, and cannot rely on the moral consistency necessarily of big nations. Real politics becomes involved, and they frequently find themselves isolated. Political peak, if I can use that term, and I think this is what happened in Greece when Venizelos was ejected. And upheaval works against these big national projects. Greece was not a unified nation as it was trying to wage this war and take on this new territory. What happened in Asia Minor, especially in regard to the Allies and Britain in particular, is kind of a reaffirmation of that cliche where the war is won, but the peace is lost. And this is precisely what happened, I think, in Asia Minor. And then the final thing I would say, and this is especially true of small nations, and maybe we're seeing this to some extent, and I'm not trying to draw a parallel here, but we're seeing some of this in Russia right now, that patriotism, national feelings for enlarging a nation have to be leavened by restraint, especially when the odds are high. And clearly the odds were very high against Greece in this particular adventure. So if I were sort of to draw a line and make a sum of what the lesson learned here is that more often than not, unfortunately, in geopolitical dynamics, might makes right, okay? And Greece was in no position to create or enforce this vision that it had in Asia Minor. So I'll stop there. put that out there and maybe create some argument.
Lou, thank you so much for that. I will say that the British also promised Venizelos, actually, if they got into World War I, that they would also give them Cyprus, which they never did. I think the concept of what you said before, might makes right, and all the rest of that is perhaps true. And in terms of the Allies, the only thing I can say about the Allies is trust no one, because in some ways you can see how the geopolitics created a scenario where they did a rope-a-dope on Greece, like was indicated earlier. France and Italy, gave arms, etc., to Kemal, as did the Soviet Union, that was indicated earlier by THEA. And we can go on. This is a fascinating discussion. Thank you again. Our next presenter is author-engineer SAVVAS Sam KOKTZOGLOU. He is the co-author with Robert Schenck of the acclaimed book, The Greek Genocide in American Naval War Diaries, Naval Commanders Report and Protest, Death Marches, and Massacres in Turkey's Pontus region, 1921 to 1922. He is a retired mechanical engineer. He received his engineering degrees from Villanova and the University of Pennsylvania, and has worked on senior level engineering positions in both private and government sectors in the United States and internationally. He has been active in various capacities in a number of organizations in the Chicago area, mostly nonprofit organizations. Prior to his engineering career, he served as a second lieutenant in the Special Forces of the Greek Army Reserves. His subject today will be about Admiral Bristol, the American High Commissioner in Constantinople, and his role at the time, and hopefully we'll read an excerpt from Lovejoy's testimony, the horror of the Smyrna quay. Thank you, Sam, for being with us today.
Thank you, Lou. I appreciate your invitation. I would like to, as I mentioned, talk a little bit about Admiral Bristol, who was the United States High Commissioner. ISMINI mentioned some things about Admiral Bristol, and I hope I can add a couple more things to what she said. He was in charge of the U.S. Navy in the Turkish waters, and he was also, in a way, acting ambassador of the United States in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire, actually. Since the United States did not have an ambassador because they did not have diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire. He was known to be a pro-Turk, despite what the present-day Turkish authors and scholars say. He despised the Greeks and the Armenians, and considered them both equally bad as the Turks. His main goal was to see the U.S. benefit commercially, regardless of who prevailed, whether it was the Greeks or the Turks. Of course, he favored the Turks, especially the nationalists. He was against the Greek occupation of Smyrna and its vicinity because he did not think that they would be able to govern the local Greeks and Turks. He considered the Anatolian Greeks better than the Hellenic Greeks, if I can use that term. His policies had a detrimental effect on the conditions of the Greeks. He suppressed any and most reports that dealt with Greek massacres and deportations so that they don't reach the U.S. State Department. Unfortunately, he was also the chairman of the Inter-Allied Commission, which was to investigate the Greek atrocities in the Smyrna and Marmara region. He proceeded to come to, in other words, the conclusions without the benefit of Greeks having argued their case. He personally, his personality and attitude towards the Greeks is evident in his two letters to the U.S. Consul in Smyrna, George Horton. I happen to have two of his, these letters of his, which I had photographed in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And in these letters, he shows his, that he despised, in other words, as I said, both the Greeks and the Armenians. And again, the reason I think for that was the fact that he knew how entrepreneurial the Greeks and the Armenians were. And he was concerned that if Greece prevailed, that the commercial benefits would have been, in other words, to the Greeks and the Armenians, and not to the United States. So although his policies had no effect in the outcome of the war, the Greco-Turkish War, as I mentioned earlier, they did have on the refugees a very detrimental, in other words, effect, as he was minimizing the suffering of the Greek and Armenian refugees, and he prevented reports, any kinds of reports from his officers and others to reach the State Department. These are just a few things I wanted to mention about Admiral Bristol. Now, I would like to read, since we're talking about Smyrna, I'd like to read a few minutes the testimony of Esther Lovejoy, which was called The Horror on the Smyrna Quay. Dr. Esther Lovejoy was the head of the Medical Women's International Association, which in the first week of September 1922 was conferencing in Geneva with kindred groups. On hearing of the terrible fire in Smyrna in mid-September 1922, Lovejoy immediately traveled to Constantinople, soon to board a tramp freighter, and quickly took her to Smyrna, even while the inferno was still simmering. For several days, Lovejoy immersed herself as a doctor in the unspeakable squalor, anxiety, despair, and tragedy of the Smyrna Quay. The only American woman to be found there, Lovejoy helped pregnant women as best as she could, gazed at the infernal gates the Turks had set on the quay, listened to the terrible nightly shrieks that Ernest Hemingway would write about later, but without comprehension, he had not been there. And daily labored alongside American sailors and officers in the American destroyer Litchfield, and a few relief workers. A very intelligent and observant witness, Lovejoy by turns effectively expresses outrage, compassion, cynicism, and deep irony in describing the terrible events that had taken place before her eyes. On the night of September 25th, the evening, she stood, 8 ships sailed on the 24th, one on the 25th, and only 4 days remained until the 30th of the September. One evening at dusk, I stood on the balcony of the relief headquarters with a native Christian woman and looked out over the shawl of tragic faces on the quay. There was a strange murmur of many refugees, voices rising and falling along the waterfront. The sound was mournful, like the moaning of the sea, increasing in volume as the darkness deepened. The language was unfamiliar, the tone minor, and the effect weird and indescribably uncanny. That night, when I went to my room, which I shared with this young woman, I found her kneeling by her bedside, praying to God for mercy. praying for the people, for ships, and for her brother's life. She had been educated in a mission school, and she spoke my language. She asked me to pray with her, but my soul was numb. Night after night, blood-curdling shrieks, such as Dante never imagined in hell, swept along the ghastly waterfront from my roommate, and I knew what the cries meant. When the Turkish regulars or irregulars, under cover of darkness, came through the ruins to the quay for the purpose of robbing the refugees or abducting their girls, the women and children, 100,000 or more in concert, shrieked for light until the warships in the harbor would throw their searchlights to and from along the quay, and the robbers would shrink back into the ruins, slink back. Robbery was systematically taking place, something also noted by Lovejoy. The description of that frantic rush to reach the ships is beyond the possibility of language. Pain, anguish, fear, fright, despair, and that dumb endurance beyond despair cannot be expressed in words. Thousands of refugees with heavy bundles upon their backs pressed forward along the quay, struggling to reach and pass through the first gate. The Turkish soldiers beat them back with the butts of their guns to make them come more slowly, but they seemed insensible to pain, and their greatest fear in the daylight was the fear of not reaching the ships. The crush of the first gate was terrible. Many of the women lost one or both shoes. Their clothing was torn and their hair hanging by the time they got through. One poor old grandmother who had become separated from her group was naked from the waist to her feet and apparently unconscious of this fact. As she ran about in the open space near where I was standing, calling pitifully for her family. Another woman whose child passed the gate just as a halt was beaten back by the soldiers, but the mother instinct is hard to control. With a wild expression of countenance, she turned, dropped her bundle, and went over the iron picket fence, which was at least 7 feet high, like orangutan. All along this fence were women attempting to climb over the gate, and get their children over. Well, this is just an excerpt, testimony of Esther Lovejoy, Dr. Esther Lovejoy. I hope it gave some of our audience an idea of what actually happened during those horrible, in other words, last days of Smyrna. Thank you for your attention.
Sam, thank you so much. I mean, we should add, with those shrieks that were heard from miles away, in many cases you had bands playing music, so people wouldn't hear some of the sounds that were coming from the quay. In addition, people should know that there were all types of battleships outside of Smyrna at the time. They weren't interested, obviously, in saving any Hellenic or Armenian people who were trying to save their lives. They were only interested in those that were coming from particular countries where the ships were from and that they had the appropriate paperwork. Your comment relating to Admiral Bristol, I think, is very interesting as it relates to American commercial interests, because it brings back from the beginning of American relationships in the area, even from the time of the Hellenic Revolution, where there were Congress people that were willing to actually vote to go to war against the Ottoman Empire at that particular time period and support the Greek Revolution. But to the extent that we had American commercial interests, in this particular case from Brahmins in Massachusetts and New England, who were trading in opium, buying opium from Turkey and bringing it to China at 4 times the value, you had a situation where the vote was not even taken. And unfortunately, what you say brings to mind also, I'm not going to discuss it, but it brings to mind also some of the current scenarios that are taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean. And unfortunately, some of the past, you almost smell the future, unfortunately. Our next presenter that we're honored to have with us today is sculptor artist GEORGE PETRIDES. His well-known Hellenic heads relating to the Smyrna burning, in this particular case called, one of them called the refugee, is being unveiled in a 100th anniversary ceremony in Athens this particular week on September the 14th. George lives and works in New York City and Athens, Greece, creates sculpture, including oversized heads, for which he is best known, figurative works, sculptures of animals, and occasionally strictly abstract sculptures in sizes ranging from a few inches to 3 times life size. Born and partially raised in Hellas, he is steeped in ancient Greek sculpture and in the works that were influenced by it, Donatello, Michelangelo, Rodin, etc. Furthermore, modernistic sculptors of the mid-20th century, such as Giacometti, and contemporary sculptors who reference ancient Hellenic sculpture, such as Ray and Bacha, and also played an important role in his work. His primary artistic interest is the human experience in the form of the body and the head, exploring the beauty and the imperfection of people and of life. His presentation today will focus on the sculpture that he is erecting in Athens, which is being unveiled, as we said, this week, September 14th. Welcome, and thank you for being with us, George.
Sure. Thank you for that introduction. You should start a PR firm, Lou. That was I was very impressed how you put that together. But
all of you are very impressive today. Thank you.
Thank you. So greetings from Athens, where it's 10 or so. I'm going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you about Smyrna because I think you are all better qualified to discuss the specifics. I'll tell you the story of one statue, which is the statue that's being unveiled in Athens, which I created on Wednesday. So we have the the mayors and the VIPs and all this coming. So that'll be Wednesday afternoon. And so if I could, I'll start. I know Professor Lamb, at least you're in the DC area and you may have seen this show, but I'll start with, I'll tell you the story of how this sculpture came to be. And so I'll look at, I think I'll just share my screen and show some images, if that's okay. Let's see. So I'll show you. Does this look like something? Like a catalog? Can you see a catalog here? Yes?
Yes. Oh, yes.
So this is a series called Hellenic Heads, which was shown in DC and Lou referenced. And Hellenic Heads is a series of 6 very large heads that I did that look at different periods of Greek history. This, and we'll show you more pictures of it. This is the piece that actually ended up being the maquette or the preparatory piece for the much larger piece that's being unveiled in Athens later in the week. The way this all happened, or the way it started, was in the Greek embassy, which some of you have been to in DC. And this is a shot. Can you see it? Can you see a picture of 6 heads?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is at the embassy. Yes. Did you happen to see these, ISMINI? Did you go at the time?
No, I was not able to. I'm very sorry. I wish I had.
Oh, sure. Well, they're in Boston now. So they started in DC for 5 weeks. Then they went to the Hamptons for about 10 weeks, and now they're in Boston. And I think the opening is tomorrow. Obviously, I won't be there. But to tell you about them briefly, and the one we'll focus on is this lady here on the right. That maybe my cursor is appearing, kind of the second from the right. And this one became the maquette for the much larger statue that we'll get into more detail. But just to touch quickly on the Hellenic Heads, what happened here is from the left, we had the heroines of 1821, which focused on the three female naval commanders of 1821, being Bubulina and Volna and Mado. In the second over from the left, we had the Archon, who represented, each of these is referring to a Greek historical period. So the Archon was meant to refer to the Byzantine period of 300s to 1400s AD. This figure in the middle, this brown figure, was meant to refer to the 40s, so the Nazi occupation and then the Greek Civil War that followed. The blue figure in the distance is the earliest one, the classical Greek period from classical Greece, 5th century, 4th century, etc. Then the brown figure looking downwards is called the refugee, which Lou referred to. And the refugee, initially it was called the Catastrophe. So it was a specific reference to the burning of Smyrna. But then the Υπουργείο the foreign ministry, told me that wasn't such a good idea. Could I not call it the Catastrophe? Because there were starting to be, even back in May, there were some issues with Erdogan. And so I said, okay, fine, I'll make it less I'll make it less catastrophic. I'll go in the direction of the refugee, which also has more universal themes of what is any refugee experience. And someone referred to Putin and Lou, I think, Putin in the current war. And so, this could also be taken to be the refugee that the Ukrainian crossing the border into Poland. And then finally on the right, on the blue, is the present. So the present is, a young person that might be looking to the future. But going into our favorite, here again, in the center, you see the refugee closer up, and then you see the refugee again here all the way much closer up. So as I was developing this statue, and tell me if this is boring, everyone, because I know you're all academic and professors and serious students of history, and this is just kind of art and pictures. But if nothing else is different. What's that?
Very nice. Very interesting.
Okay. I'll keep going. So let's go to, now you understand the background as to how this came to be. So somewhere along the way, I meet the mayor of Athens, and they say to me, "Gee, this Smyrna thing, it's 100 years, and we've got to do something, and we're doing all these, lectures and music, and do you want to make a statue for us?" And I said, "Yeah, I've done one, and I'll do a variation for the city of Athens." So to go back to my own research, the way I went about it is I did, and this is the catalog, I did my own, by your standards, very brief research on Smyrna, and a lot of it was Wikipedia based and not particularly deep, but I looked at the historical photographs, and I talked to my mother, and my grandmother did actually escape Smyrna, as did my grandfather, who was a Greek soldier, or a Hellenic soldier, as someone said, a Hellenic Greek who got stuck in Smyrna, where he met my grandmother. So I did this research of my own, and my grandmother's brother was a soldier in that ill-fated war, and so I have his ημερολόγιο, his diary. So I my research was a combination of talking to people and reading personal documents, and then being on Wiki. And then what I did with all my works, and I'll try to see if you can see this here, I go and look for art history, basically. So in this case, why do I care about art history instead of being smart enough to do it all on my own? I think that all these topics have been dealt with before. So in the case of, developing this particular sculpture, I happen to be in Florence. So in Florence, there's a spectacular museum called the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo, and it has this Michelangelo on the left, which you see, which is the final. There are multiple Pietas, but this is the last one he did, and he intended it to be for his own grave. And that figure on the upper left, Nicodemus, the highest figure with the snood, is a self-portrait. So that influenced me, you know, the bearing of the head and the mood and the scarf. And I looked at other things, but that was the primary influence. So I went to, so I started thinking about, you know, that, and obviously a female version of that, or not, I shouldn't say obviously. In my case, I was interested in a female version because I was imagining my grandmother as she might have been at age 19 or 20 when she arrived in Piraeus. So I was trying to capture, you know, the shock and the horror and the shock and the loss and you know, the phenomena of have been described by others better than me, but also some dignity and being able to, or needing to, rebuild their lives. And she did. And as I mentioned, she had met my grandfather, who was a mainland Greek, let's call him that, in Smyrna. And so they started off again. Now you'll say to me, okay, well, great, you did a different version. What does it look like? So can you see a big large head now? Does that appear?
Yes, we got it. We got it.
Yeah, so this is the version for the city of Athens. It's 1.32 meters high, and that's me. And that's a few days ago. I'm glad to say it's progressed from this point, but you can see it's an enlargement of the other piece, but also I think it's developed a lot in terms of the design and the art of the thing. Let me give you some sense of scale. That's, you know, my head and its head. It's about 3 or 4 times three times life size or so. Now this is the base, which we're still working on, and being Greece, you know, it'll all get done 5 minutes before the mic goes live on Wednesday afternoon. But this is the base, and then you'll say to me, okay, well, where is all this in Athens? And I think it's good because I think the city of Athens did something smart, which is they selected part of. Let me see if I can. This is the final part of my presentation, Lou. So bear with me 1 second if I could find this. Here, it's in Neopsychiko. It's a part of. I guess I'll just tell you because I don't know if I could find it. It's a part of Athens where people settled from. This was around 1930, but if you know Athens, refugees settled in many parts of Athens, obviously Nea Smyrni, Nea Philadelphia, and this is Neopsychiko, and this particular community was from Vourla, which was one of the Asia Minor, one of the cities of Asia Minor that ended up in Athens. And so the city of Athens selected this for me, and it's actually the historic spot of Paraga, and Paraga was the school that the refugees set up for their kids, and it only went, I guess, through. It was only it did not go past 6th grade, and this is, I guess, the refugees' kids weren't being educated in the Greek system, whatever system existed in that time, so they set up their own shack basically, where they educated their kids. So now this is a large square. If you know Neopsychiko, it's the square of Agios Georgios. It's like a massive church. It's larger than the Greek metropolis. And across from this is a small park. And so that has become where my piece is going up. So that's where that little base was that you saw. And then from Wednesday on, I'll have pictures of the actual, sculpture sitting in this thing. So I'll send you some pictures from Thursday on that show the thing all put together.
I think this is so exciting, by the way, what you're doing, and congratulations to you. I think some of the things you and others have talked about are very interesting, and one of the things that always shocks me, I have to be honest, is how the diaspora, in most cases, is more interested in some of these issues, including the 100th anniversary of the burning of Smyrna, than the Hellenic politicians are within Greece itself, and including their ambassadors throughout the world. They want to tiptoe around the issues. in particular the issue of genocide and what's taken place. It's one thing to have a war and lose a war. It happens all the time. As Lou indicated, the strong usually, win out or what have you. It's another thing to systematically exterminate a race or a religion. And that's been the case. Certainly that was brought out by the Israeli professors who wrote that book on the 30-year genocide. It's been the case from in their research, which is extensive, from 1894 all the way up to 1924. I went off on a tangent, but I thought it was very important to state that particular fact, because in many cases, others are expecting the diaspora to put up the fight that they should be talking about. And I will indicate also that the Hellenic government itself took decades to even recognize the genocide of their own people within this particular location. And it's very troubling. It's very troubling to people like me in the diaspora for us to always talk about these issues so people can understand. And they ask for us to go within our politicians to support their causes. And meanwhile, they're not helping in their own cause. I apologize for diverting the conversation a little bit, but I think it ties into the 100th anniversary. Our last presenter is Dr. PETER STAVRIANIDIS, a PhD educator, community leader in the Hellenic Genocide Issues. He's a successful entrepreneur and has been active in the Hellenic American community for decades and has held numerous leadership posts with organizations connected with Hellenic issues of the diaspora and the genocide of Asia Minor. As a passionate political activist and lobbyist for Hellenic and Pontian issues, he was instrumental in helping also in the unanimous passing of the resolution of the state legislature of New Jersey in 2006, urging Turkey, with others, of course, to respect the rights and religious freedoms of the ecumenical patriarchate. He is the past president of the Pan-Pontian Federation of the US and Canada, and in his tenure, he helped also with the first proclamations in 2002 in New Jersey and New York regarding the Asia Minor Pontian genocide, which took place. He is currently the president of the scientific and cultural organization, the Hellenic Link of New Jersey, and he sits on the board of trustees of the State Theater of New Jersey and the Harvest of Hope. Peter has a passion for education and teaching, occasionally also as an adjunct professor at the Fashion Institute of Technology, SUNY, and currently conducting research on the history of Greek Jews in conjunction with the Pantheon University of Greece. He is an archon of the Order of St. Andrew the Apostle and on the Education Committee of the Metropolis of New Jersey. His presentation will be on the Megali Idea, an illusionary dream or an attainable vision. Thank you for being with us today, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you for your dedication, your passion, and your enthusiasm, most of all. And of course, I thank all the very fine speakers. You covered a lot of the things that I was going to cover, so forgive me if I jump around, trying not to be repetitive. But what I want to start with is just making a statement that the destruction of SAVVAS and, of course, the end of Hellenism in Asia Minor is to the Turkish people a celebration. It's equivalent to our March 25th celebration. And of course, I think we should respect that, and we should respect their struggle for independence. The only thing, and I emphasize this, that we're not agreeing with is the methods they employ to achieve this, methods that have been claimed and declared to be methods of genocide. And this is something that Turkey has to come to terms with history in order to become a bona fide, modern, democratic and civilized nation as it claims to be. Then we'll be able to cohabit, that would be able to cohabit with the Greek nation in a nice neighborhoods, and you know, that will give them tremendous opportunities for political economic partnerships. Unfortunately, as it stands right now, we don't see this happening anytime soon. Now, I think we can all agree that the Smyrna Catastrophe, which of course was the end of Hellenism in Asia Minor, has been for many decades a topic quite unpleasant and unresolved, not only in the minds of the pundits of the political, academic, and diplomatic circles, but also in the hearts and souls of the contemporary Hellenes, especially the descendants of the hundreds of thousands of victims that were massacred during that horrific era, and I happen to be one of them. And of course, THEA HALO is another one, because our roots are from Pontus. So the demise of the millions of the Christian populations that inhabited Anatolia and the coast of Ionia left a big vacuum, which in the years to follow has been gradually developed into a very densely populated area called the Republic of Turkey, becoming a gruesome and strategic arm of a neighbor that keeps on reminding the Greek nationals with its aggressive actions and intimidating rhetoric that only if you command both coasts of the Aegean, you can claim ownership to the Aegean archipelago. Well, before we even touch upon the who were the main actors that contributed to the events and the how it happened, I will start the why. I also, as Professor URENECK, I have my 4 arguments. This ambitious military expedition against Turkey, a little over 100 years from the March 25th, 1821 revolution, finds Greece in a much different situation. Greece has undergone some major expansion from this skillful diplomatic, military, and strategic alliances against Turkey and Bulgaria during the Balkan Wars, and finds itself on the side of the victors, having more than double its territory. We also must note that besides the unfortunate incident of the Greco-Turkish War of 1897, when the Kingdom of Greece lost, as it was forced into paying tremendous war reparation and ceded small territories in Thessaly, Greece had won every other military engagement vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire. That's number one. Number two, the victorious powers of Entente had already decided the disintegration of the sick man of Europe, as the Ottoman Empire was called, from the middle of the 19th century. Number three, Greece found itself at the end of World War I on the side of the winners, and its military forces had not suffered any heavy losses during that period, which was between 1916 and 1918. I just want to remind everyone that Greece didn't enter the war until 1917. And number four, the 2 million Greeks that lived in Asia Minor had undergone a systematic ethnic cleansing or genocide, with using the more contemporary term. And Greece had a very strong motive to intervene, as very correctly Professor URENECK mentioned before. So the above 4 statements were the circumstances of the why. But the main ingredient of this ambitious campaign at this time which by all political and military means rendered. The golden opportunity was the irredentist vision to reclaim those lost lands which were still inhabited by Hellenic Orthodox population. And this vision was called the Megali Idea, or the great idea. Well, what is exactly the Megali Idea? What does it represent? The Megali Idea is the irredentist vision or concept for the modern Hellenic Republic or kingdom initially to expand and acquire the lands that were part of the Byzantine Empire and were still inhabited by Hellenes by ethnic identity, not necessarily Grecophones, and Orthodox by religion. This Megali Idea vision was nurtured and promoted mostly from outside forces, from distinguished individuals of the unredeemed Hellenism, from the Ionian Islands, the epicenter of radicalism and the Megali there, rendering some legendary names like Solomos, Calvos, Valahoritis, Panas, Hoidas, and later from Macedonia towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. And of course, here comes the Cretan Revolution and her legendary son, Eleftherios Venizelos, whose understanding of the Megali there is to unite this tiny Hellenic Republic with the lands and the millions of Hellenes that lived elsewhere. There is only one precondition, and that is that the interior Hellenic political system of that time would embrace the idea, this great idea, and go along with it in letter and in spirit, something that unfortunately did not occur, and because of it, it led to the tragic catastrophe. Under these circumstances, it would be politically and militarily a tremendous mistake for Greece to remain idle. The only huge question that historians, political scientists, sociologists, and students of history would be called time after time to give an answer is why Venizelos decided, amid the winning theater of military operations of the Asian Minor campaign, to declare election. After the signing of the SAVVAS Treaty, which gave Greece the Commission of Smyrna and the Ionian coast, plus a few other territorial advantages. Why? During that time, the British diplomacy for the first time was considering a solution for the Pontian issue as well, a possible formation of an autonomous or independent republic with a collaboration of the Armenians. We believe that this hasty decision entering into such dire straits during those crucial moments, and I'm talking about the declaring elections, was the beginning of the decline. But who are Venizelos' opponents? Of course, we have the Royalist Communist Alliance on one hand, and the new citizens of the kingdom, the ethnic citizens of the so-called new lands. Now, Venizelos always said during his rhetoric that it is possible for Greece to secure its future once it is in complete domination of the Aegean. Does that remind us of something? And these are words of a master politician and international diplomat. And of course, the opportunity arises May 1919, when the leaders of the great powers, Lord George Clemenceau and Wilson of the US asked Greece to embark on a military campaign that would annex Smyrna and to prevent its intended annexation by the Italians. Venizelos grabs the opportunity and as an agent, and Dolodvochos in Greek, of Entente. So the ultimate result of this action was, of course, the complete and permanent annexation of this project. We also must take a look at the different schools of thought that existed in the Athenian politics. On the side of the skeptics, we can definitely include Ion Dragoumis, one of the most avid supporter of the Greco-Turkish rapprochement, who believed that this initiative was doomed to fail since it entailed military confrontation and engagement. His vision was the emergence of a Greco-Turkish nation in Asia Minor, and not necessarily under Hellenic domination. However, the most serious of the skeptics was Ioannis Metaxas, who was diametrically opposed to such a campaign, promoting his theory that the military challenges to be met could not be overcome, as such an event would be an act of colonialism. Metaxas undermined Venizelos' vision and the operation since the expedition was launched, and immediately sided with the royalists. It is 1919, and Kemal's revolutionary army is no match to the Hellenic divisions that win every battle. Since May 1919, Venizelos has convinced the British to supply the Greeks with military equipment and finance this initiative. The morale was so high and the political and military possibilities so favorable that Lloyd George would say nothing short of treason from the Greek side or incompetence that is equivalent to treason could bring victory to Kemal and allow him and his fighters to throw the Greeks into the sea. And here is Venizelos, amid all this, I would say, winning war, to declare elections October 30th, November 1st, 1920. So elections take place, and the Venizelos party is ousted by the royalists. The new elections bring to power a government that is pro-monarchy and pro-German, and certainly diametrically opposed to Venizelos' vision, who in the meantime decided to bow out from the political scene into a self-exile. The results were dramatic. This new government managed to break away from the coalition of the Allies. Ioannis Metaxas, Venizelos' most fierce political opponent, contributed immensely to the defeat of the Anatolian Front. What is the conclusion? Greece, even today, is seeking to find accountability for the Asia Minor catastrophe and the share of this accountability among the monarchists, the Venizelos, and the communists. One would think that these are issues that should have been resolved decades ago by contemporary Greek historiography. On the contrary, they continue to exist and prohibit the neo-Hellenes to set history straight. You're bound to hear opinions like, we had no business in Smyrna. Τι δουλειά είχαμε στη Σμύρνη. Either way, Smyrna would have been lost eventually. So the question remains whether the Megali Ιδέα was an illusionary dream or an attainable vision? Well, one could say that it was definitely a dream. I mean, everything starts with a dream. And an attainable vision had the Greek political parties being in unison and taking advantage of the geopolitical games of their time. Unfortunately, they didn't. Thus, the Hellenic Republic remains a small nation with medium geopolitical value and is dependent on the ephemeral movements of power in the region. Today, with a rapid increase in economy and population, Turkey has been transformed from a nation of Asia to a nation of the Aegean and a local power looking for political and military access to the Mediterranean, being, quote unquote, asphyxiated by the Greek islands breathing in her face. Unfortunately, the actors of this tragedy could not conceive at the time the consequences of their destructive policies that caused this devastating defeat. Every tragedy of this magnitude usually ends up in some kind of a catharsis. And the execution, of course, you know, that of the six was the main ingredient of this catharsis. I would like to close and to include in my epilogue expressing the notion that exists among contemporary Greek historians, academics, and diplomats by espousing an attitude of sobriety vis-a-vis the celebration of our neighbors, nifaliotita in Greek. It's a nice word. I love this word, nifaliotita. That at times, the celebration of our Turkish friends at times could be quite aggressive and provoking. But on the other hand, demonstrating acts and rhetoric of traumatized nationalism for us is not the solution, and it certainly leads nowhere. Our best remedy would be to show respect to the victims of the genocide, to continue working as a team for the inclusion of the Hellenic Genocide in the presidential recognition of our country, and to assist in every way the Turkish neighbors, and we were discussing this before with Lou, to accept the events of 1913, 1923 as documented events of history. In the meantime, we will be working diligently for the truth to emerge and become an undisputed part of history. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to express some thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for that. It's listening to a lot of the conversation and some of the things you were talking about. It's, you know, I happen to agree with some of them. However, you can't have a catharsis. You can't have a catharsis when in fact there's no recognition of a genocide that killed millions of people. You can't have a catharsis where you had a significant population in East Thrace, in Constantinople, in Asia Minor that was Hellenic, that no longer exists. You cannot have a catharsis that you had guarantees that at least, even with the exchange, that the populations of Constantinople, the Greeks in Constantinople and the Greeks in the islands would in fact be honored. Just like you had an agreement that the Muslims in East Thrace would be accommodated. The Muslims in East Thrace have done very well and have been accommodated, and their populations have expanded. In the Hellenic side in Constantinople, which at the time of the 1920s, the Hellenic population represented over 30% of the population. Today, there's only maybe 2,000 Orthodox Christians there. The islands that we're talking about, Tenedos, etc., which were formerly majority Hellenic and were supposed to be by treaty respected, no longer are respected, quite frankly, and to a certain degree have been destroyed. You would have a catharsis if you didn't have the pogrom of Constantinople in September 6th and 7th of 1955, where you made believe that the Greeks were involved in bombing the Turkish embassy in Thessaloniki, but in fact they knew that it was an usher, a Turkish usher, who in fact put the bomb there, and you had a pre-planned attacks where people were brought in to destroy thousands of homes, thousands of businesses, and you can't have a catharsis on that basis. You can't have a catharsis when in fact laws in the 1930s and 40s, etc., were created that took all Hellenic people or Orthodox people, let's say, who were in the government, not to have any jobs, to make it impossible for them to have industries, to tax them in a certain way that created a situation where they had to leave. You can't have a catharsis when you allowed, okay, your friends, your allies, your whatever, allowed the invasion of Cyprus to take place with NATO arms. I'm not saying all these things basically to justify why there are problems. And when we talk about the so-called, Megali there that people keep talking about, what about the Megali there that the Turks have on the other side? The Megali there to take back in their language the islands that belong to them that are now Hellenic populated islands. Okay, so it becomes a very complex issue. I think this is just me speaking. If there was a recognition of what actually took place historically, and if the people respected their borders, etc., yes, then you can have an accommodation. But it's very difficult not to have an accommodation right now. And again, I hate to say this, but it's the diaspora, the Hellenes outside of Hellas, who in many cases are taking up the burden of some of these issues that are taking place. With that, I'm going to get back to our panel, and if we can, let's just discuss a little bit about what took place in the burning of Smyrna. Okay, we know that this was not just something that happened by accident. I mean, there were eyewitnesses that basically said that they cordoned off the areas, the Armenian area and the Greek area, that they had soldiers and troops, etc., pouring gasoline around these particular areas and set these areas on fire. Would anyone like to discuss a little bit further about those particular circumstances around the burning of Smyrna? Thea, would you like to discuss this issue at all?
Well, there were so many people that witnessed this, and they're on record as witnessing what was taking place. The Turks tried to blame the Armenians for setting their own section on fire, yes. But many American, I don't know, I remember if they were missionaries or others, that already saw the Turkish soldiers pouring gasoline in these areas and setting them on fire. So there's really no question about who set the fire, and no question about why they set the fire. They really wanted them out of there. They didn't want them to be able to come back, and they wanted to, erase all measures of their existence.
It's just amazing, quite frankly, that although it's obvious. One second, Lou. It's amazing that although it's obvious, okay, and there's all types of eyewitnesses with regards to that it's not recognized. Okay, it's not recognized. Sorry, Lou, I interrupted.
Lou, I apologize that I have to go because I'm borrowing somebody else's computer, okay. And I happen to be in Greece, so so I
listen. Lucky you.
Yeah, I enjoy the discussion and the presentations of all the other participants, and I am sorry I have to go. Sorry.
Not a problem, Lou. Not a problem. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Lou. ISMINI, would you like to also touch on the issue of Smyrna itself and what took place? Yeah.
Well, what I would like to share is how unexpected actors can have important influence. For example, when Horton went to Athens, the person in charge of the consulate was Barnes, who was a very young, inexperienced diplomat, shall we say, who had barely been there a few months, maybe 6 at the most. Did not know, did not understand the language or the culture very well. And he easily came under the influence of Admiral Bristol and under his control. So when Barnes sent a report about what happened, he did say that the Turks set the fire. So when Bristol received it, he wrote back and he said, "Are you sure what you saw was the Turks setting Smyrna on fire, or that particular part of it?" And of course, Barnes, understanding what that meant, says, "Well, I could not be sure what the uniforms were," or some excuse along those lines. In other words, Bristol took every opportunity to muddy the waters if it was going to make the Turks look bad for what they did. And that was another example where he tried to distort and change the truth.
You know, I think that it's on record, and I'm afraid I don't remember. Oh, I'm sorry. Is anyone hearing me? Because I'm...
No, we're hearing you. No, we got you. We got you. Go ahead, please, Thea.
Somehow Bristol made the mistake of admitting that the Turks set the fire. And I think, of course, he didn't want that to happen, but he did admit at one point that they said it.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, there's no doubt about it. Forgetting about the burning of Smyrna, which was the last major aspect of the genocide. There's no doubt that the genocide was starting, from the late 1800s, quite frankly. Certainly in East Thrace, there was all types of things taking place. As a matter of fact, Venizelos during that period was speaking to the Ottomans and basically saying to them, "Stop doing what you're doing. Stop trying to eliminate these populations. Stop bringing them, making them part of the Turkish military, for example, where they brought them out into these death camps, these battalions that they had set up, where thousands were killed, which caused a situation where people who are of Orthodox religion fleeing the country. Many Americans came into the United States actually before the war even took place in 1919 because of all these different things that were taking place within Turkey. And it's always coming down to the issue of the Megali there. We talk about the Megali there. We talk about what sort of making excuses of what the other side was doing. We understand war. We understand the Megali there. We understand those things. But what we cannot understand is genocide, systematic genocide of populations because they are of a different religion. Okay, that's a serious problem. And we haven't come to grips, in my opinion, with regards to that particular issue. If we had come to grips with it, we can all understand what happens in war, how you lose and all the rest of that. As THEA indicated, there was in fact German commanders on the ground because they were allies of the Turks, not only during World War I, but also allies of them, giving them military advice and all the rest of that from the 19th century. Everyone knows that. There was no doubt that you had certain philosophies taking place, in particular that influenced Kemal Atatürk, relating to making Turkey a nation that had only Turks and Muslims in it. And it had to do, obviously, with Ziya Gökalp, the philosophy of Ziya Gökalp, who had a tremendous influence on Kemal. So when they entered Smyrna, the army had left. The army had left 4 days before. There was no reason to decimate the Hellenic Orthodox Turkish population within Smyrna. which included not only the Hellenic, obviously, but the Armenian population, and to basically wipe them out. There is no historical justification for that particular issue in my mind. Comments from anyone, please.
I have some statistics here. The fire lasted for a whole week. And
Yes.
during that fire, 55,000 homes were burned. And from those 55,000, 43,000 belonged to Greek families, and 10,000 belonged to Armenian families, and about 2,000 to citizens of other countries. It is estimated that those regions that the fire took place, there were about 180,000 people that were residents there. So these are some statistics that I have here.
Well, the statistics and actually the history and the facts are that the Turkish area was not in fact affected.
No, it wasn't touched.
So that tells you the story.
The Turkish and the small Jewish section, but the Greek, the Armenian were completely eradicated.
There's no doubt about that, and we have at least with EMBCA and certainly all of you have been involved in these particular issues. Here we are in the United States of America, and the recognition that should be due what took place not only in the burning of Smyrna, obviously, because that was the last major genocide that took place. But this whole issue of genocide is a serious issue that has not been addressed in the United States of America. Now, we can say, obviously, and we can discuss the reasons. We can say that Turkey has had an influence within the politics of the United States itself. So what SAVVAS basically, indicated, quite frankly, exactly what the issue is, and that has to have with economic issues. SAVVAS, do you want to just go a little further on that, or what? Is SAVVAS with us?
He had to bow out, I think, because he
Oh,
couldn't
that's
stay.
right. SAVVAS did bow out. My apology. Any comments on that particular scenario? In other words, here,
I
please,
think we have all of these nations, the West, they all had designs on that. Commercial, and Germany was actively promoting the genocides even before they began in Germany, because they had economic designs on there. We have to also remember that the Christians were really the only educated population in Asia Minor, that the Turks at the time, at least, didn't educate. Most of the Turks were illiterate at the time. And so, of course, the Christians had all the business opportunities, and they had many businesses, etc. So the way the Turks had to eliminate them in order to, create their own or lift up their own society. Horton mentioned something about hearing a Turk say that if we get rid of the Christian schools, the Turkish schools will automatically pop up in their place. And I think, possibly one of the reasons why the West does not like to recognize this is because they were so involved in the genocide. Bristol, as ISMINI pointed out, he could have done so much more, and yet he didn't, because he wanted to have economic ties to Turkey, to the new Turkey, and it was almost an agreement that the genocide take place the way that the Americans were acting and the way some of the other allies were acting at the time. It was almost, giving them, a go-ahead to do that because they didn't want to anger the Turks.
Well, and they were not the only ones who did not want to anger the Turks. The missionaries was another group that was more concerned about saving their buildings and their ministries and staying on good relations with Turks than saving lives. And that really troubled George Horton, and it should have troubled a lot more people, but it was a consideration. Think of it. saving buildings and relationships as opposed with the people who are committing the atrocities as opposed to helping the victims. And some of them went back and continued having as missionaries or otherwise having relationships with the Turks even after all these horrible events. And we have to pause and think about that. Morality and doing the right thing is extremely important, and Horton was adamant about that. And he called them out. He called the missionaries out.
Well, I just want to also to add that there were some missionaries that actually left. I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead, please.
Went on those death marches with the victims, with the Armenians and with the Greeks. You know, they refused them, and I think with the Assyrians there were some. So yes, I agree with you, ISMINI. But there were also, we shouldn't forget the loyal ones that really
Indeed
refused to leave the victims of this genocide.
Yes.
I think what we should also remember, and I briefly touched on it, but within Hellas itself, they weren't, many of the Hellenes were not welcoming, quite frankly, to the victims of some of these massacres. For example, they refer to them in many cases as Turkospori. You know, they call them Yaurtofagades, yogurt eaters, etc. So, and the fact that the country itself did not recognize the genocide for decades afterwards. And even their silence today, I talked about it earlier, the silence today is annoying, quite frankly, to anyone, and to an American, because I'm an American. To an American, it should be annoying, quite frankly, that the Hellenic government has not done enough to discuss the various issues, because they feel, for example, that it may tick off the Turkish Republic. I think to the point that was made earlier by Peter, it would be wonderful. It would be wonderful if the two neighbors worked together the way neighbors should work. But unfortunately, based on circumstances, I don't see it. I don't see it. And the Megadi there almost has reversed itself in my mind. It becomes the Megadi there of the Turkish Republic. In other words,
yes,
to take back what they claim is theirs, which is, again, very disturbing.
Can I say something, Lou, in conjunction
please.
To what you said very correctly? If it wasn't for the Pontian Greeks, this issue would still be buried. I mean, I've seen it. I mean, I was very young at the time, and we did everything possible. As a matter of fact, not too many years ago, Thea and I have been on the stump trying to educate other Greeks to make this known to them, this horrible event. It's like some Jews going around to convince other Jews about the events, the horrific events of the Holocaust. So I think we should take credit. Not I think, we should take credit as Pontian Greeks about making this known and putting pressure to the government to recognize 1994, the May 19th, as a day of remembrance for the genocide. So I just wanted to throw that in there, for the record.
I couldn't agree more, and I want to thank you and Thea and everyone who is trying to educate us, educate the Greeks, and I wish we could educate the Turks. It's very hard in a more authoritarian society to really be able to read whatever you want and find out the truth. But we need, as Greeks, at least, to know our history. And talking a little bit about the apathy, it has been troubling me quite a bit, and I have been wondering why this is happening. Why would Greeks themselves would say things like, well, the Greeks did as bad, the things they did were as bad as what the Turks did, and things like that. Or like you said earlier, we have no reason to go there, or no place. Δεν είχαμε λόγο να πάμε. Well, the one thing that comes to mind is the insidious and unrelenting official position of the Turkish government and propaganda that has come along with it from the beginning to the present. And I don't know that we have done much to counter it, but it has certainly been there and has been very active in educational institutions in the West as well. And of course, in the books that educate their young ones in Turkey, and any which way they can. So I think the propaganda has been contributing to muddying the waters and not allowing us to be clear and knowledgeable and sure about our own history and what really happened.
Very true.
Certainly, there are issues on the Hellenic side which we touched on, but also, it's tragic. It's tragic that our so-called allies, were not there either. And even today, we're sitting there, trying to convince people of what took place that everybody knows took place. In other words, it's an amazing situation. And again, I'm kind of shocked and surprised, not so much by others, but I agree with you, ISMINI, by ourselves. In other words, what we are doing as a people. In other words, the material is out there. The material is out there. Most people are not even concerned. If you talked about some Greek singer that's in the United States, you can get a few thousand people to come out and listen to the singer, and everybody they like it or whatever. But if you talk about these type of issues, it's surprising how small the groups are that get together to discuss these type of issues. And I think everyone that's on this panel today is very important to the discussion and the future of the issues and what takes place, certainly within the United States of America. I'd like to just wrap it up a little bit if we can. We'll just some final words, and we'll start with final thoughts. Thea, some final thoughts on what we discussed today.
Well, on the recognition, I wanted to say that every year that the Armenians, this is for recognition in the U.S., of course, that every year that the Armenians presented a resolution to the U.S. government, to Congress, to recognize the Armenian genocide, I wrote to the head of that organization every year and told them they're not going to accept this resolution because Turkey is a very important country, ally in a very strategic place. And unless you call it a Christian genocide for all of the Christians, it will. And every single year, they just made it an Armenian genocide until this final year, when they added the Christians. The way they added them, I'm afraid, is very poorly done. It seems like the Christians were attacked, but they actually survived and just needed aid, but they were at least included. And that's, I believe at least, that's the only reason it got, well, two reasons it got passed. First of all, the US was angry at Turkey because of their attack on the Kurds during the Syrian campaign. And maybe also this, that they finally included the other Christians. I don't know if it's a theory or just a premise that I always wonder if the Turks hated the Christians so much because they were a constant reminder that the Turks actually stole that land from the Christians.
Well, there's no doubt about it. I don't know if they stole it from the Christians because before that they were the pagans. But I will say this: what's fascinating is the so-called Turks. The so-called Turks. When you do their DNA, it's just amazing what their DNA reveals. The fact that they've been brainwashed to this concept, that came out, as I indicated, by Ziya Gökalp, philosophically, where in order to be recognized, you had to be a Turk and all the rest of it. And everybody's born and raised when they were going to school, etc., to say that they're Turks, etc. And people are, when they do the DNA, people are shocked. As a matter of fact, I think Turkey tried to avoid DNA scenarios. But Thea, what you indicated was extremely important. It was also within our community an issue where, for example, people were promulgating the Pontian genocide, and again leaving out what took place in Thracia or what took place in Asia Minor or what have you. It's the same issue with the Armenians and the Hellenes. And I think, and when we get to Peter, I think he'll talk about it, where there's a movement right now to discuss a Greek genocide, not a Pontian genocide or an Asia Minor genocide. So thank you, Thea, for being with us. Final words, ISMINI, some final thoughts?
Well, I couldn't agree more with Thea. It should be the Christian genocide, and we should all be united about that, not just the Ionian Greeks or the Armenians or separating. It is the Christian genocide. We need to be united, because if we are not, that division is being exploited by those who want to hide the truth. And of course, I talk extensively how important the truth is in order to make future decisions and not to repeat the mistakes of the past. The last thing I would like to add is how important it is to hold our officials, our government representatives accountable for their actions and their decisions. And that is very important. They really cannot do whatever is expedient or because they like an ally. Morality has to come into it. What is the right thing to do? And it has to play a factor. Otherwise, we'll become complicit in terrible events in history.
ISMINI, thank you so much. And I think what's important for the audience also is that the arguments, in my opinion, should be made not as Hellenes or whatever, but as Americans. In other words, this is an American issue. We're Americans, and we who believe in certain concepts, we who do not believe in genocide and all these other things, we should push these issues as Americans, not go as some type of ethnics. Okay, we are Americans, and certainly our representatives who are supposed to represent us as Americans have to listen, and we should make those arguments on that basis. Lou, some final thoughts on what we've been discussing today?
Well, the genocide is a fact. It's well documented. The nightmare of Smyrna is a fact. The question in my mind is, where does the discussion move from there? And it strikes me that the discussion really needs to center on why has Greece as a nation not come to grips with the history at Smyrna? I don't know what the answer is. When I speak in Greece, I ask people and I sometimes get answers, but I don't feel that I truly understand why. Is it rooted in the Greek character? Is it a society or a nation, a culture of shame that refuses to confront these facts? Is it something about Greek politics? I simply don't understand. Certainly in the Greek Academy, there is not a facing up or an exploration of these issues. So I think that that's where the discussion needs to move, and that's something that needs to be understood. Lou, you get a lot of credit for leading this discussion and for moving the diaspora in a particular way. And the diaspora, and I count myself as part of that, can play a role. But really the discussion needs to move to the nation of Greece, and there needs to be a serious conversation there about what happened and how it affected the nation of Greece moving forward to this day.
Can I add something?
Please. Please.
You know, first of all, you know, I think Louis is actually right, but I think that one of the problems is that Greece is afraid of Turkey, and they're afraid of the reaction. But I also want us to address the other issue that you brought up, Louis, about Greece not supporting each other. You know, my book, I wrote a script for my book, a screenplay for my book. I can't get anybody in the Greek community to help me. The Armenians make these films. You know, how many films have the Armenians sponsored? They put so much money behind this. You know, the Greeks have to start taking responsibility for helping their culture be known to the world.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that. I didn't want to bring this up. Okay, I didn't want to bring this up, but because you mentioned what you mentioned, you know, they came out with a documentary, Lethal Nationalism. Okay, I supported it personally, financially. Okay, with a big proportion of the money involved in making that documentary, as well as another chapter from Queens. Okay, we maybe put up a third of the money to make that documentary. They wouldn't release it to us to play for free. They wanted to put it on the internet so they can charge for it. It's disgusting. And I hate to bring this up because it personally disturbs me. I haven't watched the documentary myself because of how annoyed I was. The fact that people want to use economic issues and money, etc., to support whatever they're doing and not bring it out to the public. It's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. I apologize for getting into that particular scenario, but I think I had to. George, you're doing a fascinating thing in Athens. Thank you for that. Some final thoughts.
My final thoughts are local thoughts and specific to the statue, which is similar to my presentation. I think that there's a lot of activity, especially now in September, commemorating the 100 years. There's concerts. There's things like my own. There's other things, and in my particular case, I wish we were having this discussion about 3 days from now, because I could give you a full report and give you photographs.
It's all good. It's
but
all good.
I will send you, Lou. I'll send you photographs from the the unveiling of the statue. But it seems that people are taking it seriously, and there is press coverage, and and my own role in it, I'm happy with, because it's an educational role, and I feel that if I put this up there and I walk away or I disappear, or it's the statue is alive long after I am, if the next generation sees it and wonders, what is this about? I will have done something, and then the civic authorities that put that statue there will have done something. So as much as there's frustration of, why aren't people talking about it? I think having a civic monument where a kid or whoever of a future generation can get an idea that, gee, maybe this is something I should Google. It might be interesting to learn about. So I can only look at it locally and in terms of my particular experience, and I think it's being positively commemorated, the centennial, at least with regard to my specific thing.
George, I totally agree, but at the same time, we have to continue the discussion. I mean, it's the 100th anniversary, but at least we've been talking about it for a number of years, and all of the participants that are here have been discussing it for years. It's up to us to bring people on board. And to Lou's point, I have to say that and what THEA indicated, we have to have our own discussion internally about this issue. Hellene to Hellene, to bring out some of the important issues. The diaspora, as I indicated, is doing a lot more, whether it's in Australia or whether it's in the US or whether it's in Canada or what have you, than the indigenous Hellenes, who should be very concerned about these issues. There are reasons why some of the government officials don't even want to talk about the issue. There are events that are taking place, but anything related to the Hellenic government is low key. Anything related to the Hellenic government around the issue is very low key, and it's disturbing. Peter, some final thoughts.
Yeah, quickly, 3 things. First of all, I want to attest to the fact of how supportive you have been of this issue. Anytime one of us has asked you something, you were generous, not only financially, but with your time, with your efforts, with your knowledge. So I want to thank you for that publicly. Number 2, it's like, from reading so many different authors, I see that there's a movement to become, as I use the word Nephilim, and I borrowed that from the esteemed professor and also member of the government, Angelos Irios. Actually, he's a professor of the Pontus University. This is the university I'm associated with. And he uses it very, and I think that's something that we have also to adopt. This way we can reach out to Turkish intellectuals, because I want to finish my presentation on a positive note. Most of the Turkish people, and I have quite a few Turkish friends, they are against the aggressive movements of the Turkish government, any Turkish government, not only Erdogan. Even if we look at the previous government, they were aggressive too. Nobody can deny that. So I suggest that we reach out to as many Turkish intellectuals, and we can start here in the diaspora. And there's quite a few living in New York and New Jersey. And I know, Lou, you know quite a few of them. And start a discussion with them. Start a discussion without fanaticism, without being nationalistically traumatized, either side, and start a true dialogue, because the truth, as they say, shall set you free. But first, I'm sorry for using the word that will piss you off. So that's okay, as long as it will set us free. And I would like to finish with those words.
Look, Peter, yeah, please, go ahead.
I'm not sure. I'm still, because my video seemed to conk out. But, when my mother and I went to Turkey, I cannot tell you how kind and wonderful the Turks were to us. And I think that this is really important to know, that they're not all monsters. My mother always said, because she lived side by side, the villages, the Turkish villages were side by side with the Greek villages. And she always said that it was not the Turkish people, it was the Turkish government. Because she knew, even when although she was 10 years old, she knew that the government manipulates its people. And she always felt that they were the people that they lived around. And when we went to Turkey, they could not have been kinder.
I have to obviously second that, Thea. I do have many Turkish friends, quite frankly, important friends. And I would and want to have the conversation, quite frankly, between the appropriate group of people, from the Hellenic side and the Turkish side, to have this open dialogue. My fear is not so much what is going to be said. My fear is their safety. This may sound strange to people who are listening to this conversation, but it's their safety. In other words, people who appear to discuss these issues have to be very careful, safety-wise, what happens to them, especially depending on what their positions are in the public sphere. So I will take that under advisement. Peter, we did talk about this, obviously, to do something like this. And in fact, we may. I'm just, again, fearful for the Turks. With that, ISMINI, if you can, tell us about what's going to happen next Saturday at Georgetown University.
Well, we're having a mini symposium to memorialize and illuminate the Asia Minor catastrophe on the occasion of the centennial. So we're very honored that you will be opening it up, and then we will have a panel discussion. And we will have the head of the Armenian Institute, the head of the American Hellenic Institute, my co-author and husband, Chris. And then we will have the ambassador introducing the award-winning movie, Smyrna, My Beloved, and we will have an exclusive screening in Washington, D.C. I know there's been one in New York and one happening in Los Angeles, but we will have it at Georgetown for the first time in the Washington, D.C., Baltimore area. So we're very excited, and I'm hoping that Horton's descendants might be able to attend. I'm not sure about that yet. But that is what is happening in order to discuss what truly happened in Smyrna and discover new insights.
Thank you, ISMINI, and thank you to the panel. This has been a fantastic panel. I don't want to end it like this as an end, because I'd like this to be part of a beginning of more panels that we're going to have in the future about these and other issues. For the audience, thank you for being with us today. You can find out about what we do at EMBCA, EMBCA, the East Mediterranean Business Culture Alliance, through our website, embca.com, embca.com. And some of our past panel discussions you can find on our YouTube channel under EMBCA. Thank you again for this fantastic discussion, very enlightening discussion with our panel. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Lou.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.